Hi, my name is Jerry Anderson, and I am the creator and producer of Space 1999. This episode is called Dragon's Domain, which I think you'll find very interesting to watch. And perhaps one of the most important things I should tell you is that the film was originally shot on 35mm colour film, but it has now been upgraded to high definition. Making Space 1999 presented us with all kinds of difficulties. It was, I think, really the same as all the shows I seem to make. It was very complicated, and it was very, very expensive. One of the areas where we spent a huge amount of money was on sets, although my idea of using Lego type components to make sets, tear them down and re-erect them as something else worked very well, and we got, I'm sure as you can see, very spectacular results which we could not have otherwise afforded had we gone the conventional route. However, having said that, we still had to land on alien planets. And when we landed on an alien planet, then there was no alternative. We had to build the interiors, and of course sometimes the planet surfaces themselves. And this was very, very difficult. I think what came home to me very, very quickly was that we live in a remarkable world, because Keith Wilson was the art director, and I would say to him, now on this planet we want to see vegetation and flowers that are definitely alien, nothing like anything we've seen on Earth. And of course we found that whatever we designed was already in existence. You know, I would say we could have trees, say, that had huge flowers, you know, maybe a foot across, and then we would find that such a tree existed in the Amazon. And when it came to plants, unless they had a base with stalks and leaves, they didn't look like plants. You know, one couldn't recognize them as plants. It looked like something else. And so Keith had a tremendously difficult job to cope with that, and I think he did remarkably well. Nevertheless, these sets were very expensive to build. The planet's surfaces, of course, meant that soil and sand and rocks had to be brought into the studio, and as soon as we finished shooting, they all had to be taken out. The stage had to be cleaned up, ready for the next set to go up. So that was just one of the many problems.
Check.
Been playing computer all day.
I was hoping for a real game, Commander.
A word about the American office. ITC. ITC was a British company, and it was the distribution company of Lou Grade, who financed all my shows. And it had a subsidiary in New York. The people who worked for Lou in New York, they were American, of course. They had a worrying task, because what is satisfactory in our country is not necessarily satisfactory in America. And Lou used to rely on them to advise on what aspects of the show we were currently making would be successful in America, and what aspects of the shows would not be acceptable. And one of the major problems, of course, was the British voices. If we had an actor who spoke frightfully well, and I'm thinking of, say, Prentice Hancock, who was one of the crew on Moonbase Alpha Control, that would be acceptable. But Cockney, unless it was driven to an extreme, was not acceptable in America. In fact, when they heard a Cockney accent, they used to think that the people they were watching were Australian. And also, of course, we had to be careful, and I particularly was very careful, to avoid mid-Atlantic accents. Those so-called mid-Atlantic accents were unacceptable here, and they were equally unacceptable in the States. So it was always a question of judgment. Martin Landau, Barbara Bain, well, of course, there was no problem. They were perfect for America. They'd been seen in this country over and over again on their show Mission Impossible, so they were fine. But the English actors, we had to be very careful with. Zena Merton had a sort of slight accent, which was neither American nor English, and that helped her to get by. Nick Tate, another person who featured in the film regularly, he was Australian, and so it was easy for him just to go the extra mile and do a very believable American accent. But these are the things we had to watch constantly. And of course, the people in the American office, who were obviously trying to do the best for the show, were constantly in touch, saying what would work and what wouldn't work. So I wouldn't blame them at all, but because we were in London making an expensive show, we had to shoot each episode in 20 days. It really was very, very difficult to take on board their comments. I mean, sometimes their comments came when they had seen a show that we sent over, and of course it was too late then to do anything about it.
That neither you nor I can understand.
Hell, he can't even understand it. That's why it's haunted him. It's destroying him.
Look, John, I know the Ultra Probe meant a great deal to you, but its success was vital to Cellini. He can't take failure. For that reason alone, you would have been the better commander of that probe.
Stick to Cellini.
All right. I say that he made a disastrous mistake on that probe ship, and being the acknowledged ace, can't bring himself to admit it.
It's not his style.
He thinks he's infallible, you think he's infallible, but I don't.
Helena, nothing was proved.
One of the things that comes to mind, having made it quite clear what the American office was doing, or what their job was, the president of ITC New York came over while we were in production, and we put 3 of the latest finished shows in the theatre for him to see. And he went off and he saw 3 hours of our productions. And when he came back, I thought he was going to say, Jerry, they're absolutely terrific. Instead of which he came back absolutely white as a sheet. And I remember saying, Abe, what's the problem? He said, well, I've just seen 3 shows, Jerry, and there's not one monster in any of them. And I was completely thrown. I said, monsters? What do you mean? He said, don't you know, in America, it's the thing. Everything that's any good has got monsters in it. People love monsters. So I said, well, do you want us to put monsters in from now on? He said, absolutely, as quick as you can. Well, he went back to America, and in a couple of days, we had got every monster maker in the country on our payroll. Now, we had men running up and down the corridors in rubber suits and rehearsing the various parts they were going to play as monsters. And we put monsters in some of the shows.
Still, I wish I was going.
I think it was about 3 months later, Abe came back, and I said, okay, but there are 3 of the latest pictures in the theatre for you to see. And he went over, and 3 hours later he came back, and again he was white as a sheet. And I could see he was very angry, and I said, well, now what? And he said, Jerry, you've got monsters in the shows. Well, I mean, I was just stunned. I said, well, of course we've got monsters in the shows. When you were last over, you asked that we should put monsters in the shows. And he said, yeah, but I mean, that was then, but monsters are out of fashion now in America. Well, I give that as an example of how people who are trying to help and are well-meaning can really damage a show. And I have to tell you that today, I'm talking about 2005, I will not tolerate anybody giving advice or trying to help, and I make a stipulation that I'm the only one that can make decisions, and never again will I make a show where I have other people involved.
Nothing disturbed the measured pace of the voyage. No malfunction of the ship broke the monotony. Navigation was faultless. For days, excitement mounted as progressive readings confirmed the planet's condition was similar to Earth's. Plans were made for a manned landing, but as the probe ship moved behind Ultra, all contact was temporarily lost with Moonbase Alpha. The landing was never made.
Darwin, could you give me an opinion here, please?
Metallic, small and stationary.
Orbital reference 109. Beam everything we've got in that direction. We're going to take a look.
Right.
Fantastic. Where have they come from? What are they doing?
A typical example of producers' problems, I'm talking about myself now, of course, is that with this episode, we had to show a space graveyard which comprised many spaceships of different design hanging motionless in space. And the shot itself was simple enough, but all these ships had to be designed and built. And that put a great strain on our model workshops because they, they had their hands full doing things for other episodes. But again, I gave the okay, and somehow they managed to make all these ships, and they were then hung up in the studio against a space background and photographed.
Docking seal is perfect. Atmosphere is safe.
Temperature 28 degrees. Radiation
0. What could be better?
Come on, Sesame, open up.
just a check, Darwin.
I'm waiting to go there too. Opening now.
Of course, in this particular film that you're watching, it had a monster, but that was not because of the request from New York. We just had a good story, which happened to feature a monster, and I thought, well, we'll make it. I have to say, my job as producer can be quite difficult because if I read a script, I'm actually visualizing the action as I'm reading it. In other words, I'm like a person watching the film already made. I can hear the music, I can hear the special effects sounds, I can hear the dialogue, and I can visualize the action. And so I can find it myself reading a script and thinking, by God, that's going to look good. And then realizing it's also going to be a huge problem to make. And then I'm completely torn. I have the choice in slicing up the script and reducing the important moments, or to dump the script and get another one written. And so I go through this battle every time, and I'm afraid without fail the part of me that wants to make the film wins the day, and I say with some trepidation, okay, let's go ahead on this one. And this was one of those pictures. I think everybody involved on this production had their own problems which they had to overcome. I think that many of my problems were overcome simply by the excellent relationship I had with all the members of the crew. And I knew, and I have to confess that I took advantage of this, I knew that if I let a script go through that was virtually impossible on first reading to film, I knew that everybody would try their level best to put it up on the screen. And I can't really remember looking back any one script where they finally said, "Jerry, we simply can't do this." Somehow they managed to get through. And had you have come to the studio when we were filming this, you would actually see a lot of very, very tired faces. People were working such long hours and under such pressure. But, you know, it was that element that made these pictures so memorable, and the fact that they've lasted so long.
Into a low orbit round Ultra, which hurled him back towards Earth. He survived alone in that module for over 6 months.
As with, I was about to say all my shows, I think to be accurate, as with nearly all my shows, Barry Gray wrote the music. And of course, Barry sadly died some time ago, but his work lives on. And of course, as my series are repeated, so people are reminded of his music. Barry was always very helpful. He was a very clever man. I first came across Barry when I made my very first television series made with puppets. It was called The Adventures of Twizzle, and it really was a preschool program. And the woman who wrote the show, her name was Roberta Lee, she used to quote-unquote write the music and the songs. And in fact, what she did, she used to hum the tunes into a tape recorder and sing the songs. This is where I first met Barry, and he would take her tape and he would listen to, I'm sure she won't mind me saying, this out of tune humming that she did, but nevertheless it conveyed the music she wanted to have in the show. And Barry would then orchestrate it. And of course, when one heard Barry's orchestration, it was quite remarkable compared to what we had heard previously with Roberta humming the tune. And I made The Adventures of Twizzle and also another show called Torchy the Battery Boy, both for the same person, and Barry orchestrated her music in the same way on both. And I thought that Barry was a very clever arranger, but I didn't realise that he was also a composer. And one day I said to Barry, "Do you reckon you could compose music?" And he got very offended, and he said, "Compose? Of course I can compose music. I am a composer." So I said, "Well, what are you doing orchestrating this stuff?" And he said, "Well, I'm an orchestrator as well." And then he told me that he could play 9 instruments to the level required for him, if necessary, to play in a symphony orchestra. And he was also very interested in recording of music. And in his home he had what at the time was very, very advanced. He had a 24-track recorder, and he was very proud of the fact that a lot of the simple pieces of music he could actually record at home. But as we all know, Barry wrote the music to Space 1999, and in common with all Barry's work, it brought the picture to life when the soundtrack was put on.
Believe me.
There was also a man, I haven't seen him for years, and I do hope he's still around, but his name is John Peverell, and he was the sound editor on a lot of my shows, in fact most of my shows, and he used to produce some remarkable sounds by mixing sounds together. I mean, these days with modern technology, you can produce all kinds of effects. I won't say very simply, because nothing's simple, but you know, the fact is all kinds of effects can now be produced electronically, whereas at the time it was a devil's own job to make any sound that was different from the norm. And like Barry, when John's tracks started to run against the picture, and Barry's music would thunder in, you know, the pictures always came to life.
No, of course not. But I mean, here's a man virtually come back from the dead. And naturally, he should have...
And indeed, if you want to see how important sound is to special effects, when you're watching a program next, anybody's program which has special effects, and turn the volume right down and watch it mute, and you'll suddenly see that the special effects lose 80% of their value without the soundtrack. So both those elements were very, very important to all my shows, and in particular to Space 1999.
Morning, gentlemen.
Good morning.
Oh, sit down, please. Oh. We are in the red, aren't we? Strange that there's nothing like failure for drying up the money supply. Well, I hope we've all got some strong ideas for alleviating the drought.
Commissioner, what about the positive aspects of the mission? Why can't we concentrate public attention on the Earth-like qualities of the planet Ultra?
I'm afraid that vague possibilities don't carry the PR power of a thumping, dramatic failure.
All right, then let's be positive. Let's launch a second probe right away, take our experience and put it to good use by getting right out there.
Before we get carried away with the future, Koenig, we must first concentrate on the past. I want to know what you two think really happened out there.
I'm the only one who can answer that, Commissioner.
Oh, yes?
You've had my report.
Oh, the whole world's had your report. That's my problem.
It's also the truth.
Or an elaborate cover-up for an error of judgment you haven't the guts to admit. Now, what do you say to that?
It's just not true.
Now, I need to know what you two have to say. Do you believe in monsters?
Well, I believe that whatever caused the disaster affected Tony's mind in some way which he can't recognize and we can't even guess at.
Koenig?
I've said a number of times in this commentary that there were all sorts of problems we had to face. And one comes to mind where there was a rupture in one of the rooms on Moonbase Alpha, which allowed the air to escape. But of course, the pressure of air inside the base was very, very high, and the pressure outside in space was absolutely nil. So the moment there was a rupture, there was an explosive decompression, and everything and everyone in the room was sucked out of the window. And again, I know I'm talking about my problems, but my problems, reflected on the crews who were making the episodes. And I read this, and I could see it happening. Wonderful, bang! The window would go, and then stuff would be sucked off shelves and crash into walls or go through the window. And whoever was in the room would grab hold of something, maybe a handle, and then finally that handle would be pulled out of the wall, and they would fly through the window out onto the moon's surface. Now, I can't claim credit for this, but I can explain how it was done. It was a scene involving Nick Tate, if I remember correctly, and the entire set, and I mean these sets are big and they're weighty, and they have to be strapped together. I mean, they can't fall down. Apart from the fact that nobody wants to hurt the crew or the artist, obviously, but insurance would come down on my neck if I tried anything that wasn't safe. And so the guys came up with an idea, and they built the set on its side so that the window in one of the walls of the set was now on the top of the set, and that the whole set was on its side. And then Nick Tate was suspended above the window, and he was dropped through the window and landed on a platform that was made especially to receive him. Now, of course, this was shot with the camera also on its side, so that through the camera what we were seeing was, in effect, the set the normal way up. Now, when we saw the rushes, what we saw was a normal set, and we saw Nick Tate flying through the air and shooting through the broken window and disappearing. So that little example, shows the things we used to get up to stage things properly.
That's very beautiful. Is it for me? Thank you.
I must admit, I got a little help from the guys in the hydroponic unit. Mm-hmm. But I deserve some credit. What I'm trying to say is, I'm sorry I chewed your head off.
Well, you're doing it in a very nice way.
How's he?
Much better.
I don't understand. It's 5 years since the Ultra probe. Why should he break now?
Because it can happen at any time, which is exactly why I recommended that he never be returned to Alpha.
Helena, I requested it.
Can I speak?
Tony. Now, just take it easy. It's all right.
Here, let me get these.
What happened last night?
I felt there was something.
Where were you going? There's nothing around, nothing for billions of miles.
You had a nightmare last night at 0347. Medical computer raised the alarm, and I woke you. Remember?
It was nothing.
Well, Tony, we found a tomahawk buried in the communications post in your quarters. Was it the monster? And why now? What were you trying to do in the Eagle? Were you trying to run away from it?
I was going to face it.
Commander, we have a contact. Could you come to main mission, please?
All right, Paul. I'll be right back.
John, something quite extraordinary.
Kind of a space motor show. Well, Victor?
It's the same sort of thing Cellini described. The mission to Planet Ultra.
Victor, last night, Cellini had a violent nightmare, fighting his monster. Now, after the nightmare, maybe even as part of it, he tried to steal an Eagle. I had to stun him. Now, he just came round, and I asked him what happened. He said he was going out to face it.
But the monster?
Well, those could be the same spaceships he saw behind Ultra.
But there were other problems that nobody could possibly have expected. I can't recall the name of the episode right now, but we had an episode where we had to have a snow planet, where the whole planet was covered in snow. And I remember speaking to Keith Wilson, and he said, well, you know, I don't know how we're going to do this. I said, well, you know, the script's gone in for production. You'll have to think of a way. And he came back a couple of days later, and he said, I've found a way. He said, what we'll do is we'll make the rocks and the caves out of chicken wire. You know, this is wire that can be bent around very easily into different shapes. And I've been in touch with a company who specialise in pumping foam into cavity walls in houses to keep them warm. It's a very good insulator. And they have said that if we build the set, they will come in and spray the whole set with this foam, which then sets, when I say hard, as hard as icing on a cake. And you can light it and it'll withstand the temperatures and the problem will be over. Well, the set was designed and it was duly assembled in wire, first of all. And then the truck arrived and the men came in with this huge length of hose and their motors started, and lo and behold, they were spraying what looked like snow, and it was settling on the wire netting, and at the end of a number of hours of work we had our ice planet, and we were all very pleased until we went on the stage the next morning and the whole stage reeked of formaldehyde. And it made our eyes water, and we said, well, you know, I said, we can't get actors to work on here. And of course, they were due to come onto the stage, I think it was, in about 3 days. And so we put on the extractors in on the stage. These are giant fans in the roof. And we left the doors open. And the next day it was better, but not good enough. We then called in experts who took air samples and declared that the amount of formaldehyde in the air was safe. And so I went and told Martin and Barbara, who by this time were quite worried about the whole thing, that it's just been declared safe. And she said, by whom? And I said, well, by experts in formaldehyde. And she said, well, yeah, but that's under English law. I want to know what they say under American law. And so we had to send the makeup of this foam to America, to some institute or other, and declare roughly how many square yards we had on the stage and what the ventilation was like. And also we sent them the results of the English tests. And back came the answer that under English law, the amount of formaldehyde in the air is considered to be safe. Under American law, it is not considered to be safe. And Martin and Barbara came in to see me, and they were very apologetic, and they said, look, we understand the problem. We understand the difficulty you're in, but, you know, there's no way you can ask us to go on that stage when our own countrymen have reported that it is unsafe. And so we were faced with a major drama. Now, one of the sequences required in that particular episode and on that particular set featured Brian Blessed and John Shrapnel. Brian Blessed is a tough guy, mountain climber, you know, and he's like Man Mountain himself. And a very fine actor, John Shrapnel. I called them into my office and I said, look guys, we're in terrible, terrible trouble. Would you be prepared to work on that, on the grounds that the English tests we've carried out say that it's quite safe? And without even thinking, they said, absolutely, Jerry. And so we had to shoot the scenes out of order, and Brian and John did their work on that stage. They never complained. They were absolutely marvellous. And by the time we had finished the sequence with them, the smell had gone and the formaldehyde had disappeared. And then Barbara and Martin came in, and I think Martin Landau smiled at them both and said very warmly, I think you guys are crazy, but thanks. And Martin and Barbara came on and we continued filming, and once again we got through, and we weren't held up.
Alan, line up for docking on the probe ship. Make it as smooth as you can.
John, we're getting life signs on the probe ship. Cellini's. If there was anything else, we'd be receiving it.
Providing our instruments can read it.
sequences that involve the monster, even today, in my view, look very good, very exciting and very frightening. But if I tell you, I've just finished a brand new series called The New Captain Scarlet, which is made wholly in CGI, computer-generated images. And the only reason I mention that is now when I look back on Space 1999, I look at this sequence with the monster and I really just wonder how we ever managed to put it together without the aid of computers. And I can tell you what I remember about this particular show and this particular sequence was that the monster was made by Keith Wilson and his model makers. The monster itself, the tentacles were made of a rubbery material. They had to keep their shape, and yet they had to be capable of being pulled about by fine wires. I mean, we had to test to find wires that could take the weight of those tentacles and move them, and yet were fine enough not to photograph. Well, of course, what I've just said is an impossibility. I mean, you can't put a wire in a shot and expect not to see it. And so, of course, there was a lot of work done on the set with the camera operator talking to the special effects man and getting him to paint the wires to match the background so that they wouldn't be seen. And then the late Frank Watts, our cinematographer, he had to light very, very carefully to make sure that they weren't seen. And of course, we had to shoot a whole sequence of shots that, when cut together with people's reactions to the monster, made an exciting sequence. But what I do remember is that there were a lot of people working behind the set in the monster's mouth. And when somebody was pulled towards the monster, the actor and the director had to work together to make it look as if he was being pulled by the tentacle. And then as soon as he went through the hole, people out of picture would grab hold of him or her, and they would fall over, and they would slide them up a slope until they disappeared. And then, of course, when the monster disgorged the remains, people behind the set would put the remains of a human body, which had to be specially made, obviously, onto the slide, and it would slide down and out of the monster's mouth onto the floor. And then, of course, we had to use lots of smoke and steam and use what in the trade we used to call ulcers. Ulcers were a circular piece of hardboard with lots of different shapes cut into them, and this would spin in front of the light, and it would spin either quickly or slowly, but it would cause the light to change on the set and bring it to life. And so we had lots of ulcers being used. So, you know, you can see that when you watch it now, I hope I haven't spoiled it for you, but I don't think I have. I mean, I've seen it many times, but looking at it as I'm recording this commentary, it still looks good today, despite the fact that we were using old technology at the time.
The monster was more than any of us could believe. According to our criteria, it was never alive. So how could we be sure that it was dead? As we hurried back to Alpha, before our moon drifted beyond reach, we could only wonder about the astronauts of those other fabulous ships. All we know about them is their terrible fate, the fate of Tony Cellini. John, if we ever do find a new place to live, and if we succeed, we're going to need a whole new mythology.
Tony, Cellini, and the monster? No.
Well, St. George and the Dragon sounds pretty flat, till you know the story.
The story is part of our history now, Helena. I think Tony would be very happy to know he put new life into an old myth.